Chapter 6 of Molly Make Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Molly Make Believe by Eleanor Hallowell Abbott. Chapter 6. It was one day just about the end of the 5th week that poor Stanton's long accumulated, long suppressed perplexity blew up noisily just like any other kind of steam. It was the first day, too, throughout all his illness, that he had made even the slightest pretext of being up and about. Slippered, if not booted, blanket-wrappered, if not coated, shaven at least, if not shorn, he had established himself fairly comfortably late in the afternoon at his big study table close to the fire, where, in his low Morris chair, with his books and his papers and his lamp close at hand, he had started out once more to try and solve the absurd little problem that confronted him. Only an occasional twitch of pain in his shoulder blade, or an intermittent shudder of nerves along his spine, had interrupted in any possible way his almost frenzied absorption in his subject. Here at the desk, very soon after supper time, the doctor had joined him, and with an unusual expression of leisure and friendliness, had settled down lollingly on the other side of the fireplace with his great square-toed shoes nudging the bright, brassy edge of the fender, and his big meerschaum pipe puffing the whole bleak room most deliciously, tantalizingly full of forbidden tobacco smoke. It was a comfortable, warm place to chat. The talk had begun with politics, drifted a little way toward the architecture of several new city buildings, hovered a moment over the marriage of some mutual friend, and then languished utterly. With a sudden, narrowing-eyed shrewdness, the doctor turned and watched an unwonted flicker of worry on Stanton's forehead. "What's bothering you, Stanton?" he asked quickly. "Surely you're not worrying any more about your rheumatism?" "No," said Stanton, "it isn't rheumatism." For an instant the two men's eyes held each other, and then Stanton began to laugh a trifle uneasily. Doctor," he asked quite abruptly, "Doctor, do you believe that any possible conditions could exist that would make it justifiable for a man to show a woman's love letter to another man?" "Why, yes," said the doctor cautiously, "I think so. There might be circumstances." Still without any perceptible cause, Stanton laughed again, and reaching out, picked up a folded sheet of paper from the table and handed it to the doctor. "Read that, will you?" he asked, "and read it out loud." With a slight protest of diffidence, the doctor unfolded the paper, scanned the page for an instant, and began slowly. "Karl of mine, there's one thing I forgot to tell you. When you go to buy my engagement ring, I don't want any. No, I'd rather have 2 wedding rings instead, 2 perfectly plain gold wedding rings, and the ring for my passive left hand I want inscribed to be a sweetness more desired than spring, and the ring for my active right hand I want inscribed his soul to keep, just that. And you needn't bother to write me that you don't understand, because you are not expected to understand. It is not man's prerogative to understand. But you are perfectly welcome if you want to call me crazy, because I am utterly crazy on just one subject, and that's you. Why, beloved, if—" "Here!" cried Stanton, suddenly reaching out and grabbing the letter. "Here, you needn't read any more." His cheeks were crimson. The doctor's eyes focused sharply on his face. "That girl loves you," said the doctor tersely. For a moment then the doctor's lips puffed silently at his pipe, until at last, with an almost bashful gesture, he cried out abruptly, "Stanton, somehow I feel as though I owed you an apology, or rather owed your fiancée one. Somehow, when you told me that day that your young lady had gone gadding off to Florida and left you alone with your sickness, why, I thought, well, most evidently I have misjudged her." Stanton's throat gave a little gasp, then silenced again. He bit his lips furiously, as though to hold back an exclamation. Then suddenly the whole perplexing truth burst forth from him. "That isn't from my fiancée!" he cried out. "That's just a professional love letter. I buy them by the dozen, so much a week." Reaching back under his pillow, he extricated another letter. "This is from my fiancée," he said. "Read it, yes, do." "Aloud?" gasped the doctor. Stanton nodded. His forehead was wet with sweat. Dear Karl, the weather is still very warm. I am riding horseback almost every morning, however, and playing tennis almost every afternoon. There seem to be an exceptionally large number of interesting people here this winter. In regard to the list of names you sent me for the wedding, really, Karl, I do not see how I can possibly accommodate so many of your friends without seriously curtailing my own list. After all, you must remember that it is the bride's day, not the groom's. And in regard to your question as to whether we expect to be home for Christmas, and could I possibly arrange to spend Christmas Day with you, why, Karl, you are perfectly preposterous. Of course, it is very kind of you to invite me and all that, but how could mother and I possibly come to your rooms when our engagement is not even announced? And besides, there's going to be a very smart dance here Christmas Eve that I particularly wish to attend. And there are plenty of Christmases coming for you and me. Cordially yours, Cornelia. P.S. Mother and I hope that your rheumatism is much better. That's the girl who loves me, said Stanton not unhumorously. Then suddenly all the muscles around his mouth tightened like the facial muscles of a man who is hammering something. I mean it, he insisted. I mean it, absolutely. That's the girl who loves me. Silently the two men looked at each other for a second. Then they both burst out laughing. "Oh, yes," said Stanton at last. "I know it's funny. That's just the trouble with it. It's altogether too funny." Out of a book on the table beside him he drew the thin grey and crimson circular of the Serial Letter Company and handed it to the doctor. Then, after a moment's rummaging around on the floor beside him, he produced with some difficulty a long pasteboard box fairly bulging with papers and things. "These are the communications from my make-believe girl," he confessed, grinningly. "Oh, of course they're not all letters," he hurried to explain. "Here's a book on South America. I'm a rubber broker, you know, and of course I've always been keen enough about the New England end of my job, but I've never thought anything so very special about the South American end of it. But that girl, that make-believe girl, I mean, insists that I ought to know all about South America, so she sent me this book, and it's corking reading, too, all about funny things like eating monkeys and parrots and toasted guinea pigs, and sleeping outdoors in black jungle nights under mosquito netting, mind you, as a protection against prowling panthers. And here's a queer little newspaper cutting that she sent me one blizzardy Sunday telling all about some big violin maker who always went out into the forests himself and chose his violin woods from the north side of the trees. Casual little item. You don't think anything about it at the moment. It probably isn't true. And to save your soul, you couldn't tell what kind of trees violins are made out of, anyway. But I'll wager that never again will you wake in the night to listen to the wind without thinking of the great storm-tossed, moaning, groaning, slow-toughening forest trees learning to be violins. And here's a funny little old silver porringer that she gave me, she says, to make my old grey gruel taste shinier. And down at the bottom of the bowl, the ruthless little pirate, she's taken a knife or a pin or something and scratched the words, 'Excellent child.' But you know I never noticed that part of it at all till last week. You see, I've only been eating down to the bottom of the bowl just about a week. And here's a catalogue of a boys' school, 4 or 5 catalogues, in fact, that she sent me one evening and asked if I please wouldn't look them over right away and help her decide where to send her little brother. Why, man, it took me almost all night. If you get the athletics you want in one school, then likelier than not you sleep up on the manual training, and if they're going to schedule 8 hours a week for Latin, why, we're in creation." Shrugging his shoulders as though to shrug aside absolutely any possible further responsibility concerning "little brother," Stanton began to dig down deeper into the box. Then suddenly all the grin came back to his face. "And here are some sample wallpapers that she sent me for our house," he confided, flushing. "What do you think of that bronze one there with the peacock feathers? Say, old man, think of a library, and a canal coal fire, and a big mahogany desk, and a red-haired girl sitting against that paper. And this sunshiny tint for a breakfast room isn't half bad, is it? Oh, yes, and here are the timetables and all the pink and blue maps about Colorado and Arizona and the Painted Desert. If we can afford it, she writes, she wishes we could go to the Painted Desert on our wedding trip. But really, old man, you know it isn't such a frightfully expensive journey. Why, if you leave New York on Wednesday, oh, hang it